Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Calderón Muñiz. Welcome to the very first podcast of 2024. I should say podcast episode. Yeah. We are so excited to have y'all join us again. I'm super excited. It is a new year. A lot of people start new resolutions. People pick up on resolutions that they had for 2023 and now are going to bring forward to 2024. I don't know about you, Phil, but I'm feeling a lot of emotions.
Yes. Yes. Today we're going to be talking about a lot of memory stuff. We're going to be talking about emotion a little bit as well. But I am excited on New Year's resolutions. I'm willing to bet that every student listening to this probably has some resolution related somehow to studying or something like that. But that is obviously a big part of kind of everyone's lives. I do want to no one asked, but my resolutions this year are going to be mostly fitness based. I feel like I spend too much time sitting in front of my desk, stuck to my computer. And so I am very much looking forward to getting out. I actually got a membership to the Y last month. And so I'm like, it's so cold that I want to go exercise, but I don't want to go outside. And so this lets me go swimming and stuff during the during the week if I can find a free spot in my schedule.
Yeah, one of mine is also related to being more active. In Boston, it's just so cold. I am not built for the cold, Phil. You know this. I need sunshine. I need warmth. And then going outside when it's cold, it's hard to motivate yourself to do that because you're bundled at home, nice and warm. I'm someone that really likes walking. And so getting more of that time in, figuring out how to balance that is going to be interesting. But time management is high up there on the list, the to-do list for this year, which, like you said, if a lot of our listeners have some kind of studying related goal, some kind of time management goal might be a good idea to tag on to that studying goal to make sure that you're maintaining your sanity.
Yeah, I was literally just thinking through. I'm like, if I can find time in my schedule, then I'll go to the gym. No, I need to set a goal to find time in my schedule is what I really need. So maybe that time management is also what I need as well. I do want to encourage students. I know that both of ours were kind of focused on getting time management and getting some exercise. I really encourage students, if you are trying to, be as functional and effective as you can as a studier, as a student, do try to carve time out for yourself. Try to organize your time well, but also make sure that you're not spending literally all your time studying and that you are getting some physical exercise. I know that I would not have listened to that information when I was studying for the MCAT. So be better than me. But I talk about this a lot, but taking time to take care of your own health makes your brain work better. So definitely try to make that a priority, because if your biggest priority is studying, making sure that you have time to exercise is actually going to make your studying more effective. So let's kind of bring that back. I know we're kind of talking about emotion. We're talking about memory as well. And I know we kind of talked about memory a little bit last episode. We're ending the last year and starting this year on how to learn and remember stuff. There's one thing, this idea of a flashbulb memory is something that the MCAT will occasionally test, and I think it's also useful to just understand. This is a strategy that a good friend of mine, I don't talk about him much on the podcast, but usually it's my friend Joe who I'm talking about. This is my friend Brian, who's different. Turns out I have at least two friends, is what we're learning from this. But I once remember talking to my friend Brian about how he was able to remember all these side effects of all these drugs that we're going through in pharmacology, because it was just so much, and there's so many side effects and things like that. And what he told me was, I realize now, is a flashbulb memory strategy, which is where a flashbulb memory is when you tie a memory to an emotion, and an emotion, when you're in an emotional event, you tend to remember stuff better. That's why traumatic events you tend to remember. Really happy events you tend to remember. Most people remember their wedding day. right? They also probably remember, if they're divorced, the day that they like decided on divorcing, right? Like those like really emotional times tend to stick in your head. So I was talking to my friend Brian about how did he remember all these side effects. And he told me, he's like, well, I make up stories about like, I forgot to check this patient's potassium after I gave him this drug and then they died. And I'm like, that's terrible, Brian. What are you doing? What? Well, that's a terrible thing. It's like, yeah, but I'm always going to remember to check potassium, and I'm going to remember that this thing causes potassium levels to drop. And that's something that kind of stuck with me, like that strategy, a lot like that memory will stick with him. So this idea of flashbulb memories, or just emotionally charging a memory, can cause those memories to stick around. Now, most of the time that happens, like I was in a car wreck and I remember that, or where I remember when like my significant other proposed, or things like that. But you can also just kind of making up stories that have an emotional charge to them. And those are going to stick a little bit better than memories that are just like, I'm trying to memorize this fact. Like this drug makes my potassium levels fall. Like, no, I gave this drug and I forgot to check potassium, so someone died. Like that is going to stick a whole lot better overall.
Yeah. And I also think that that might be why when we're actually having patient experiences in medical school, and I suspect you can attest to this, I feel like we've talked about it before, those experiences, we remember the actual, the science behind the drugs, or what we need to do, what tests to run, what to be thinking about for a differential diagnosis, meaning what possible illnesses could be at play for anyone who hasn't heard that term before. And there is that emotional component for a lot of us when we're taking care of patients. And so that is something that, in a sense, supercharges our memory, and definitely something, like you said, that we can take advantage of. And I want to say that, there are some emotions that are particularly powerful, and that's where, that fear, that heightened stress response versus general, content, or like, oh, that's nice, right? There is some emotion like that's nice, that's pleasant, but it's not strong emotion. And so what you're describing with these flashbulb memories, for anyone who didn't pick up on it, is these more intense emotions. And so those stories that we tell ourselves when we're, trying to remember something can be really helpful. And I wasn't planning on thinking about it this way, but it's almost like the memory palace, just in a different context, right? So with the memory palace, we were talking about location and following a story. Here, it's the emotion tied with following a story. And so the power of storytelling is quite powerful. Yeah. That's, just kind of like taking a big step back. Memory and like the hippocampus has a big role in like the limbic system, which connects to a lot of different things. There has been a lot of, as I mentioned, kind of connections to navigation there, but also emotion is a big part of the limbic system as well, with the amygdala. And so it just kind of makes sense that those are things that our brain kind of has this pressure to try to hold on to. If something caused a really emotional like problem in your life, you should probably remember that, just like from an evolutionary perspective. And so our brains are kind of hardwired to anything that causes a strong emotion. We should remember that, because that's an important thing. And so, we can just kind of hijack that a little bit, like we did with the method of loci. We're kind of like connecting it to navigation and the memory palace. We can also try to tie this to just emotion overall. And try to hijack that, our brain's natural ability to remember emotional events better. Let's just tie that and manufacture emotional events that we can tie to those things. Just remember to separate fact from fiction.
Yes.
So something else that we can do, we hinted at this when we were talking, well, actually we talked about it when we were talking about short-term memory, and we talked about it with respect to remembering a phone number, and it was chunking. And so rather than remembering 9 individual numbers for a phone number, 9 or 10?
7.
3,
or
7. 10.
7 or 10.
One of those numbers. Then, we can pair them, because normally we do 3, then 4. That's 10, not 9.
Yeah.
And so chunking in that moment can help us keep something in our short-term memory and our working memory. But we can take advantage of this with long-term memory as well, because if you're repeating information and consistently seeing that information chunked, you can recall that information chunked. And so that's something else that you could take advantage of longer term. And when you pair ideas, that can also be really helpful. So if you're thinking about enzyme kinetics, if you remember the three main not enzyme kinetics, enzyme inhibition, there we go. If you remember, right, competitive, non-competitive, uncompetitive, and you always have those three together, they are now associated very tightly with one another. You remember one, you pull up one in your memory, you're going to have the other two associated right there with it. And that can be very helpful on test day, because the moment you see an enzyme mentioned in a passage, like if you see an amino acid mentioned in a passage, be on high alert for a question on one of those topics.
Yeah. I was also thinking just like amino acids themselves also go into that, like the acidic ones, lump them all together. The basic ones, lump them all together. That's actually how I encourage students to study it. Like, don't try to study all your amino acids in one day. Say, like, today I'm going to study the alkaline ones. Tomorrow, the acidic ones. Then the non-polar but aromatic ones. And then the polar ones. And then the non-polar, non-aromatic. And just kind of like working through that in that way, kind of like we'll start to group them in your head, which can be a lot better. I like that phone number thing. Like, I feel like this always just makes more sense to students when there's like an actual example. Like, if I asked a student to remember these series of numbers, 8, 1, 1, 3, 9, 5, that's a whole lot harder than remembering 81, 13, 95. And like, it's the same series there, or 811, 395. Like, that might actually be easier in that later stuff where I'm remembering kind of like two numbers, 811 and 395. And so you're chunking them into these like two groups here, rather than trying to remember the individual like single digits, right? That might actually be harder, even though technically it's the same amount of information. It's just you're grouping them. And our brain tends to, for some reason, be able to handle groups and treat it as remembering a single thing, rather than trying to remember each of the individual pieces in there. It doesn't make any sense. I don't know why our brain works that way, but it definitely does.
Yeah. And this is something that you could take advantage of. So we've been, talking about this in an auditory format, but also visually. If you pair these things on a sheet of paper, when you are going to recall this information on test day, some of us, we can hear that voice in our head telling us, 81, 13, et cetera. But some of us can also then picture, like actually see an image in our mind. I don't know about you, but there would be times where I would be taking an exam. This would be an undergrad, and I'd highlighted something on a paper. I'd written something on a paper, and on the exam, I'm like, okay, it was on this page. It was about halfway down the page. It was in yellow. Okay, I don't know why I chose yellow. I normally write in like blue, red, green, but and that's something that you can take advantage of as well, and chunking information on review sheets. And I'm a very big proponent of review sheets. It was something that I didn't do well for the majority of undergrad, but in studying for the MCAT, I started adopting it. And then through med school, I definitely continued making review sheets. It's actually something that I still do whenever I'm trying to learn new, science content and whatnot. I think it can be really helpful. And you brought up mnemonics, and I know we haven't talked about mnemonics. We haven't given our favorite ones in a while. But one of the ones that I really like is flat peg. And it's chunking a couple of words, the first letter of different hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary. And so flat is FSH, so follicle stimulating hormone. The L is luteinizing hormone, so LH. A is adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. And then T is TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. I also want to point out that part of what's helpful about flat peg is the first set are tropic hormones. And so they're hormones that control the release of things down the line. And so that can be very helpful in thinking about, okay, how are we going to distinguish the ones that are tropic versus, and affect other glands and the release of other hormones versus are kind of standalone. And then for PEG, we have prolactin for the P. And then there are some people that leave the E as blank. And there are others that think of endorphins. So depends who you ask is going to...
Yeah. It's tricky because endorphins are released, but then the endorphins are also released from other areas of the brain.
Exactly.
And so it isn't exclusively pituitary. But it is done by the pituitary. I always mention the endorphins just because it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. And then we have growth hormone for the gene. And so this is where mnemonics are essentially chunking and can be really helpful. And I know mnemonics helped me through a lot of different material because there's just so much to learn and to memorize. And so that's something that we can use to our advantage.
Yeah, that's the flat peg one is definitely one of my favorite ones. I know a long time ago we did an episode just on some of our favorite mnemonics. I feel like we should do that again just because it's really useful. And some of mine have changed. Yeah. Some of my favorites have changed.
Let's do it.
But that's also a good, kind of also an idea of chunking, right? Like flat and peg, like the FSH, LH, ACTH, TSH, prolactin, endorphin, growth hormone. And so it's a lot easier for me to remember flat peg and then fill it in than it is for me to remember like a long list of hormones, especially because if I don't have some strategy for that, there's a good chance I would forget one or two, kind of going through that. I do this like, kind of like connecting it to things, right? Mnemonics, review sheets. I know you mentioned like writing things in color. I really am a big proponent of this. I also did not do review sheets really in undergrad. I didn't even really do it for the MCAT like I should have. But when I got to med school, I started doing it a lot and it saved me. That was a really good strategy. There's something about organizing the information on a piece of paper that would help organize it in my head and make it kind of stick around. But I also like that idea of like writing things in different colors. I know you mentioned writing something in yellow. Whenever I wrote anything about parasympathetic or sympathetic, my parasympathetic stuff was always written in blue because it felt calming, like blue, like rest and digest sort of thing. And the red was like the action, like fight or flight. And like red is like a very aggressive color in my mind, like blood and fighting. And so sometimes I would remember stuff, not just like I wouldn't be able to remember, like, was this thing parasympathetic or sympathetic, but I would remember seeing it written in blue. And like, honestly, like that was enough. I'm like, oh, that's parasympathetic. This is also kind of touching on this idea of multimodal memory, which is when you are hearing and seeing and like, or speaking or things like that. Like if you can bring in information using more than one sense, that tends to be better. That's why it's better to, like if you have an option between watching a lecture with subtitles, like audibly, and you're reading it and you're hearing it and you're seeing the person say the words, you will remember it better than if you just listen to a recording of it. Because it is engaging fewer parts of your sensory organs. And so your brain just has less stuff to kind of like pin and connect things to. And that connection tends to be like a big deal, right? And that's really what a lot of kind of like how memory works overall is like making connections. It's also something that I think the MCAT is particularly tricky with. And so when you're studying, if you can try to connect things to other known material, like that's going to engage your brain and help you kind of like organize this stuff in a really positive way where you remember it better. So when you're learning about, like, let's say digestion, right? If you think about, I know this is silly, but if you think about like your mom's favorite or your favorite meal that your mom cooks, right? And like, that's kind of like, I'm connecting these ideas, right? Then that starts to kind of like, one, maybe connect some emotion to this, where that's going to like make that a little bit more positively charged. Positive, like emotion, not positive as in like cation. But that you might start to kind of like make some connections there and feel like that. And the same thing with like personality disorders. If you think about like some like celebrities or family members who like might have some personality disorder, and that like that'll help you remember that for sure, because you're connecting that. But I also just want to like real like careful, like big picture. I think that's one of the reasons that the MCAT is so difficult, is because they're constantly testing this. Don't get me wrong. There's an unreasonable amount of information on the MCAT that they'll expect you to know. But what makes the MCAT even harder is that they constantly test that information from weird angles and from weird points of connection. And so they'll ask you about the reduction potential of things in the electron transport chain. They'll ask you about the capacitance of a neuron, right? And so they'll ask you about like connecting these topics in kind of weird, strange ways. And so it's really important that when you are studying that you're thinking about those kind of connection points. I think for me, redox stuff like oxidation reduction is far and away one of the best examples of this, where students study redox stuff in lots of different classes, but they often don't connect those pieces of information together, right? Like in chemistry, you'll often do you'll assign oxidation numbers and then just like balance reactions. In biochem, you'll talk about the electron transport chain, where electrons are moving from one thing to the next. In orgo, they'll talk about redox reactions with like an aldehyde turning into a carboxylic acid would be an oxidation. That's actually where the term oxidation comes from, is like adding bonds to oxygen is an oxidation, and removing or reducing the number of bonds to oxygen is a reduction. So it turns out the biochemists, like the organic chemists, were the ones who actually named redox, like oxidation and reduction. Because if you think about it, like why is losing electrons called oxidation, right? Like that doesn't make sense, but it's because of what was going on with that. And then that kind of eventually spun out. But it's even in things like circuits and physics. Like in a circuit, if it's a DC circuit, electrons are leaving one end of your power source, your battery, and running to the other end. So you have an oxidation, you have a reduction in there as well. But when's the last time your physics teacher brought up the electron transport chain? Or when's the last time your organic chemistry teacher brought up circuits? Probably never. But the MCAT all of a sudden is going to try to test those things in those weird ways. And so often what I'm doing with students a lot of the time is trying to help erase those boundaries in their head, because they learned it in a very compartmentalized thing where this is redox, this is in like orgo, this is biochem, this is physics. And like most students don't think to use what they know about physics to answer this metabolism question. But that is something that is not only something you can do, something you might have to do on the MCAT. And so that makes things a lot more complicated.
Yeah. And that's part of why you mentioned, having to break down these boundaries that we've come to associate with different topics. And it's part of why when I'm reviewing material, and this is something that I recommend to students as well, I take advantage of what's called spreading activation. And so this idea that you bring something up into your memory, and then whatever is connected in your mind to that idea, you go with it. And so it will start a cascade of different connections. And so to your point, right, you might start with the circuit, and then from there, you move on to the electron transport chain, and you kind of keep going down the line. You go to the aldehyde, to the carboxylic acid. And so that can just letting yourself free flow, essentially, information when you're reviewing can be really helpful as well, because it starts breaking down those boundaries and those barriers that we have. Well, we meaning our academic lives.
Yes.
I should say, not we as in us specifically, have come to build up. And so there are a lot of ways to take advantage of these things when you're studying and when you're thinking about how to retain information long term.
Yeah, that's also one of the reasons that I really encourage students to not try to study one topic and cross that off, but like to mix, like over the course of a week, do physics and biochem and psych and sociology and general chemistry and orgo and physics.
Yeah.
And like putting all of those things together, you may find that like yesterday when you were studying electrochemistry, that may be kind of like coming back into your head tomorrow when you're reading about the electron transport chain. And you're like, wait a minute, there's some things that connect these. And so that's one of the reasons I really encourage students to do that, is because it helps kind of break down those barriers, those artificial barriers that are there just because of how we are taught overall. I know nobody is asking this question, but honestly, this is why I love teaching MCAT stuff, is because I get to talk about how a battery relates to the electron transport chain, connects to organic chemistry, and how you can figure out ubiquinol versus ubiquinone, which one is carrying electrons based on orgo, like ketone versus alcohol. And so just knowing your functional groups. And so being able to like make those connections is something that's really kind of fun and interesting. And like if I was teaching just a physics course, I wouldn't be able to do that, because I'm like, I just got to teach the physics, right? But I get to teach the physics of biochemistry and orgo and putting all those pieces together, I think makes a more interesting picture. And I think also connects things closer to like what you see in kind of real life. Because in real life, you don't have like people without biology and chemistry and physics, right? Like they are mixtures of all of those things, and understanding them all and how they work together is a big part of that.
Yeah. And it's also what you're going to be doing in medicine, because if someone comes in with a cough, there are reasons that they might have a cough that are related to systems other than the respiratory system. And so if you only ever study a cough with a respiratory system, you might miss out on someone having trouble in an illness related to their cardiovascular system or their GI gastrointestinal system. And so you have to be able to make those connections when someone comes in with a symptom and say, okay, could be this, could be that, could be that. Don't want to miss that, right? And so
I'm immediately saying it's neuro. It's got to be neuro. Like the neurology, people always think it's neuro, but there is some stuff with vagus nerve that causes cough, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, there's a little bit of everything, right?
Yeah.
They might even have acid reflux. So there is a wide range from COVID to acid reflux to neuro. But you're going to be doing this for the rest of your career. It's gonna sound a little harsh, but get used to it, right? Take advantage of it. And so we're talking about different ways to take advantage of being able to recall information, but the MCAT also has an element of recognition, which is very helpful. So recall is pulling it from your memory, not that you've seen it and are, connecting with what you already know. Whereas recognition is, oh, I see it. I know what this is. And so you're going to have both elements on the actual exam, that recall and recognition. Quite a bit of it is going to be recognition. And so I know we've talked about this in the past, and I think you brought it up, Phil. You don't have to know the exact structure and be able to draw the exact structure of cholesterol from memory, but you better be able to recognize it on test day. And they might have structures that you don't recognize, but you say, oh, that looks like cholesterol though. Steroid hormone, right? Maybe, and maybe they've given you a steroid hormone. You don't know exactly which one it is, but you can start making those connections based on what you're seeing. Or there might be information that you've got to pull from your memory, right? That recall that can be helpful when you're answering questions.
Yeah, and it's really important to know the difference between them, because recognition is just easier. Like being able to recognize something, it's much easier to be able to recognize cholesterol than draw it from memory. And when you're studying, understanding how you're going to be tested on it, that should shape and change the way that you're studying the material. Don't keep drawing cholesterol over and over until you can draw it from memory. Like that is not a good use of your time. On the other hand, there are some things you will need to be able to recall. Off the top of my head, like equations are probably the biggest thing. There will be times where you need to use an equation to solve a question, and they're not going to give you the equation, and you got to pull it from memory. Now, there are some equations that I feel like start to get so complex that I think if the MCAT was going to ask a question, they might give you the equation. And the MCAT will absolutely give you passages that have equations that you have not seen before. And so they're just seeing if you can utilize those. But understanding that means that I need to be able to draw my equations from memory, right? That's how I'm going to be tested. So I need to know those a whole lot better. Versus identifying ATP versus cholesterol versus a triglyceride versus a sugar, right? Those things you don't need to have that kind of be able to draw them from memory, but you should be able to draw out your equations.
Yeah. And this is where I think how students use flashcards can make or break their ability to use that information on testing. Because if you're using flashcards in a way of, oh, do I recognize this, right? So for example, if the card that you're given and exposed to is the equation itself, and you just need to identify, oh, this is for, this is a kinematics equation. Do you know that you're actually going to be able to recall that? Yeah. Or are you limited now to recognition? Versus if the flashcard and the part that you're first seeing is list the kinematic equations, right? Now you're forcing it to be recall instead of recognition. And so we've talked about this before. Flashcards have their time and their place. They're great for content that you just need to memorize. But knowing whether you're going to need this information in recall format versus recognition should influence the cards that you use and how you use them.
That's a really good example. Like if you're trying to figure out your like electrostatics, like your flashcard should be write out the 4 electrostatics equations, right? Or what are the units for all of the electrostatic stuff? And you need to be able to recall that from scratch versus just like identifying the equations. That's a lot easier, but that's not what the MCAT's going to do. Identifying cholesterol, yes. And so that should change. It should change and shape the flashcards that you're doing. That's a really good point of like, how do we use flashcards to kind of match that, and like, what is the AMC going to expect with this?
Yeah.
There is some difference in like different types of recall. I know we talked about that flat peg before, but that's a good example of cued recall. So cued recall is when somebody like gives you something and like, can you figure out what it is? Like if I say, I honestly was literally just doing this with a student earlier today. I'm like, well, I drew out this reaction. I'm like, do you know what this reaction is? And they're like, no. And I'm like, it starts with an S. And they're like, oh, saponification. I'm like, yeah, that's it. So it's a perfect example of cued recall, when if you're given a hint, you could like figure it out. So for like flat peg, I remember that mnemonic, and that allows me to do cued recall, like which one starts with F, FSH, which one starts with L, LH, which one starts with A, ACTH, TSH, prolactin, endorphin, growth hormone. And it's really like, given those cues of I know they start with these letters, it's really easy for me to recall all of them. And it also makes sure I don't miss any. And so that cued recall is something that I think is important to be able to do. I actually think that honestly is, amino acids are super important, but they're never going to ask you to write out a bunch of amino acids. You're going to have multiple choice. And so if you just recognize, oh, Q is glutamine, if they said list all the polar amino acids, and if you can't do that from memory, but you can if it says like glutamine, I know that, or Q, I know that's glutamine, I know that's polar. Like if you can fill in those blanks, if you're given a little bit of a hint, that's enough for that. And so you don't need to be able to sit down necessarily and write them all out from memory. But if given like a letter or a property or something like that, you should be able to identify them.
And the cool thing is that as you get more exposure, because amino acids are the kind of thing that you don't just want to do them once and then never look at them again. Yeah. You want to make sure that you're refreshing every so often because they're so insanely high yield that there may come a time where you are able to draw the side chains from memory. Yeah. And that can be helpful on test day because you're going to, it's going to be faster, right, to make those connections. And maybe you don't remember exactly if you labeled it as basic or acidic, but if you remember the side chain, you're like, okay, that was acidic. And so that exposure in and of itself is going to be helpful. We talked about the curve of forgetting. And so we want to make sure that we're consistently exposing ourselves to information that is high yield. Use it or lose it. And so there's another type of recall that is serial recall. And so it's the ability to remember information that you were given in a sequence in that sequence. And so thinking about phone numbers, right? That's something that you need to remember in the order that you were given the information. And so being able to remember that order from memory, right, as a recall instead of recognition also has its time and place. And so thinking about the metabolic pathways, the different, glycolysis, right? You better know that the right as soon as that glucose is inside the cell, you got to add a phosphate and trap it inside the cell. Because if you associate that with the end, you've just missed a critical step, and it's going to actually make it harder to understand the pathway itself. Because if you remember the order in which things happen, you're able to connect the dots of why, and that why, in addition to being really important for cars, can be very helpful for learning material and being able to remember it long term.
Yeah. Metabolic pathways are a really good example of that. I also think like anything where there is a set order of things, like what happens during an action potential, right? Sodium channels open, and then the sodium closes and potassium opens, and then potassium closes, and it's got to be in that order. Or like with the heart, where it goes like SA node, AV node, bundle of His, then Purkinje fibers, or like the flow path of blood or the digestive tract. Like those things, you need to be able to remember all the parts of it, but you also need to be able to remember it in order. I think being able to visualize and kind of like have drawings and things like that is a big part of that. Coming up with stories, the method of loci is really useful for that. Like study sheets are really useful for that. But just kind of understanding that idea of like a serial recall or remembering a series of things in a particular order, that's also something that will come up. There's also just straight free recall, where you just have to recall something completely from scratch. And that's where a lot of those equations come in, especially the high yield ones, like equals HF, C equals wavelength times frequency, 1 over focal length is equal to 1 over object plus 1 over image distance. Like some of those equations, you need to, without any hints or any clues, or even if they don't say the word photon and they don't say the word light and they don't say the word lens, you need to be able to pull up those memories and kind of like retrieve that equation. So that's a big part of that as well that you want to be kind of aware of.
It's also helpful to keep in mind that the more information that you're trying to remember, the easier it is to remember what you were first told and what you were last told. Because if you're thinking about, oh, I'm trying to remember 10 steps, right? It can be harder to remember those ones in the middle. And so these have specific terms that you need to know for the MCAT, the primacy and recency effect. So primacy, thinking prime, first, start, and then recency, it is recent, so it's toward the end. This doesn't have to be for material that has a set order. It can be for anything that you were given. And so, for example, when you were giving the numbers, Phil, I remember 8-1 were the first two. Couldn't tell you the middle ones for my life. But it's, yes, in that case, it has a set order. But for example, you tell a patient, shoe, car, red, add a couple of extra things in there. They'll probably remember the shoe and the car. Whatever you say in the middle, not so much. But then if you ended with, I said shoe, might as well do sock. So sock and sunshine, right? If those were the last things you told them, you can bet that they're going to remember those. And so that's something that we keep in mind when we're talking with patients and we say, okay, there's a lot of it. Let's say that you're having a really important discussion with a patient about side effects. Let's go with side effects, right? You don't want to toss the most important side effects in the middle of the list that you give them, right? That's something that maybe you start off with or you end with, but that way you're very clear. And so if they are to remember something, take advantage of this for your future patients and for yourself. And so that's something I wanted to throw out there because I think it's helpful to have little nuggets for your future career as well.
Yeah, I really like that. Like whatever is the side effect you're most worried about as a physician for your patient, start with that. Like put that at the beginning of the list so that's more likely to like stick in patients' brains. I also think about this often when I'm looking at like passages and having students go through passages where they tend to kind of like forget big chunks of stuff in the middle of passages. Like they tend to remember like the beginning and especially the end when it comes to passages. But very often they'll miss stuff kind of in the middle. That's why it's really important when you are reading passages to like, if you see something in the first or second or third paragraph that you think is super testable, like highlight that, right? Like there's probably something going on. Like if they give you a number in the physics or the chem phys section, like you might want to be like, oh, they're probably going to make me use this. Or if they say competitive inhibitor partway through the passage, like, there's going to be a question on that. And so you don't want to get to a point where you get to the question, you kind of forget. It's not even just forgetting what was the right information, but you forget that information was there. And so students get to the question and they're like, oh, maybe I need to look at the structure of this thing. And like, they don't even realize, oh, not it's in the passage and they just read it a moment ago, but they forgot. And so we tend to lose the middle of things. We generally remember the beginning and we remember the end of things a whole lot better, especially things in lists.
Yeah. So hopefully you'll remember what we talked about in this podcast episode. I'm curious to see if people remember what we talked about in the middle. But something that we also want you to remember is that we recently did an Ask Us Anything or an AMA Ask Me Anything, but there's 2 of us. And that was really fun. And so we want to continue to answer your questions and we want to do another one coming up. And so similar to before, if you have questions that you want us to answer, be it about the MCAT, be it about applications, our experience in med school, we are happy to do so. And so either send us an email at podcast@jackwestin.com with whatever your question is, or you can leave it in the Q&A for Spotify or as a YouTube comment. And we'll do our best to keep up. And we're really excited, probably next month, depending on how many questions we get, to do another episode so that we can answer y'all's questions.